Good evening, Commission. This evening, the Planning Commission will consider the city's draft housing element. Joining me in the presentation is Amy Sinsheimer with PlaceWorks, the city's housing consultant, who will assist in the presentation. I'll also have Heather Davis with Rincon Consultants, who will assist in responding to Commission questions and consideration of this item. And I'm Kathleen Mallory, the Planning and Sustainability Manager. The city's sixth housing element is a required element of the general plan. The housing numbers used in the housing element are referred to as the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RHNA, and they're set by the Southern California Association of Governments. The housing element is required to be reviewed and certified by the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. The housing element covers an 8-year state-mandated update schedule. In this instance, the years 2021 through 2029. The housing element is a required element of the general plan, and it's required to be adopted by no later than October 15th, 2021. The housing elements do not require the city to build the specified number of units allocated to the city under the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. The city is, however, required to accommodate the units under the guidelines set by the state. The housing element does not provide funding for construction of housing. The city does provide significant funding and incentives for various affordable housing projects, such as the provisions that are not mandated under the housing element. The housing element does not make actual changes to ordinances or zoning. However, the city's ordinances and zoning must be consistent with the general plan, and in this instance, the housing element. Therefore, rezoning actions to implement the housing element will be required in the future, and that is described in Program 3 of the draft housing element the Commission is considering this evening. The housing element also does not authorize the construction of residential developments. Rather, it provides the policies to facilitate construction. What do housing elements do? They establish housing policy for the construction of units. Housing element policies are outlined in Section G of the draft document before the Commission this evening, and they cover the city's 5 housing element goal topics: housing and neighborhood conservation, development opportunities, housing assistance and special needs, government regulations, as well as fair and equal housing opportunities. The housing element provides direction for implementation of programs to meet existing and projected housing need for all income levels, with a focus on programs to meet lower income housing needs, special needs housing, and address affirmative housing disparities. The housing element also provides an inventory of available sites for housing to meet the city's RDA allocation. In terms of the past housing element, or that prior cycle known as the 5th cycle, which covers the periods of 2013 through 2021, the housing element, during that time frame, we constructed approximately 2,200 dwelling units, and that was across a variety of income categories. 42% of the permits were issued for lower income housing, while 39% were for above moderate income. State law requires that Regional Council of Governments determine the existing and projected housing need for its region, otherwise known as the RDA Allocation. On March 4th of 2021, the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG, approved the 6th cycle RDA allocation for Ventura County. The city's final allocation is 8,549 units. Oxnard's allocation makes up approximately 35% of all the dwelling units within Ventura County. Oxnard population compared to the rest of the county, in 2020, the city's population was 208,100 versus Ventura County's overall population of 812,718 units. In other words, Oxnard's population represented approximately 25% of the overall Ventura County population, but the city received 35% of the overall RDA Ventura County allocation. The city did not appeal that allocation, and the city's final RDA stands. This table outlines the sixth cycle RENA allocation for the 8-year planning period, or the years 2021 through 2029. Within the lower income category, which is comprised of extremely low, very low, and low, the city received a final RENA of 2,911 units. In the moderate income category, the city has a 1,538 dwelling unit allocation, and the above moderate is 4,100 units. In January of 2020, the city's Housing and Economic Development Committee, or HEDC, held a meeting on local preference and inclusionary housing. The city's existing inclusionary housing ordinance presently requires projects with 10 or more units to restrict 10% of those units to affordable housing in the lower income category, while projects within urban village areas are required to include 15% of their overall units to the affordable housing level. And the city has 6 urban villages throughout the city, throughout the various areas of the city. And those urban villages are established in the city's general plan. The city's inclusionary housing ordinance also includes a local preference requirement that developers offer affordable units to qualified Oxnard resident buyers and renters on specific waiting lists. At the January 2020 meeting, HEDC asked staff to evaluate strategies within the city's housing element being updated to encourage local preference in all new residential development where legally feasible. The draft housing element continues policies regarding local preference for affordable housing where legally possible. And it requires that we look at allowing that where legally possible for projects with development agreements or through conditions of approval. Over the next few months, staff will evaluate the feasibility of local preference requirements, discuss inclusionary housing with housing advocates, and continue working with the upcoming Regional Inclusionary Housing Ordinance study being taken on by Ventura County Council of Governments to evaluate the feasibility of an amendment to the city's inclusionary ordinance. Also, in October of 2020, City Council provided policy decisions and direction which helped guide the 6th cycle housing element before you this evening. Direction was given to discontinue the All Affordable Housing Opportunity Program and utilize the state's default density of 30 units per acre. Direction was given to utilize up to 1,000 ADUs or accessory dwelling units or junior ADUs to meet the city's lower income RENA. And that was based upon the analysis that supports that 1,000 units within our housing element. There was also direction to implement where legally feasible local preference and updates to the inclusionary housing ordinance where feasible, study revisions to the ordinance as mentioned, and then adopt a plan or program to encourage housing in the business and research park zone and selected commercial areas. And then finally, the council gave direction to develop a program to look at housing in the area known as the high quality transit corridor. This graphic shows where accessory dwelling units have been located throughout the city, and it visually shows the extent of those units throughout the city. The pink dots are ADU locations where ADUs have been either approved, proposed, or are currently under construction. And the right-hand side shows an example of junior ADUs and how those could be constructed on a property. The graphic before you here shows on the left the city's downtown general and downtown core area. That area already meets or exceeds the state's default density of 30 units per acre. And on the right-hand side is a graphic that shows the extent of the city's one and only high-quality transit corridor, which extends from US 101 down Oxnard Boulevard to roughly Channel Islands Boulevard. And it's an area that the city is actively studying for additional density and consideration of programs to support housing in proximity to transit stops and transit stations. Also on March 9th of 2021, the Housing and Economic Development Committee provided direction for staff to create a new program, which is not currently within the draft housing element presented to the commission. We have added a new program known as program number 40, titled Institutional Institutional Land Use Housing Opportunity Program. And that's an addendum within your staff report as well. This program would pertain to institutional properties only. Institutional properties are owned by organizations having a social, educational, or religious purpose, such as a school, church, or hospital, club, or lodge, and they are located within various zones throughout the city. The reasons why we're looking at allowing housing within those institutional areas is that as part of our site inventory process, staff identified a number of vacant and underutilized parcels associated with those properties. Many of those parcels are associated with religious institutions and include land associated with large parking fields. The housing department also has received input from nonprofit institutions that are interested in developing affordable housing. The institutional program concept is known as Program 40, and it would include studying over the next 1 to 3 years a program that could allow vacant and underutilized parcels associated with institutional properties to consider either affordable housing, supportive housing, or shelters with existing assembly and institutional uses. We would also then create development standards which would be appropriate and compatible with the adjacent land uses. At this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Amy Sensheimer.
Good evening, Chair and members of the Commission. As Kathleen said, I'm Amy Sensheimer with PlaceWorks, and I'll be presenting next bit of the presentation for you. So this slide shows the analysis that's been done in the housing element. This is in Chapter F of the public draft. And you can see across the top the RDA allocation numbers that Kathleen already described. And then it breaks out how the city is proposing to address those RDA numbers over the course of the planning period. So Kathleen did mention the 1,000 accessory dwelling units that are anticipated. Those would all be anticipated to be affordable to the lower income categories based on the analysis that we've done here for the draft. There are also 1,370 units across the different income categories that are located on purely vacant sites. And then there are quite a few more units, about 6,000 on non-vacant sites. And the state defines what is vacant and non-vacant very precisely. And so non-vacant includes parking lots and other sites that may not have much happening on them, but they are considered non-vacant for the housing element. And then finally, we have sites that are in areas that are pending annexation into the city. So there are 1,157 units on those two sites. And you can see that when all of that is calculated, it adds up to more than the number that is required to meet the RDA in each of the income categories. Next slide, please. So we want to talk a little bit about how the city is proposing to address the RDA using sites in the city. This map is found in the supplement in the housing element, and that's at the end of the document, and it includes this overview map. It includes all of the sites, a table with all of the sites that are included in the housing element that corresponds to this map. And then it also includes some focused exhibits. And you'll see there are a series of pages where there's an aerial photo with map information, as well as some details on a series of sites. And those are the sites that actually address the lower income part of the RDA numbers. So again, this first map is your overview of all of the sites that are proposed to be in your inventory. Next slide, please. So this slide talks a bit about the requirements for meeting the RDA in terms of the sites that are currently available in the city with appropriate zoning for different densities and allowing different types of housing. So again, there are a total of 8,500 dwelling units that the city is looking to address during this planning period. 2,911 of those are in the lower income category. So this slide really focuses on actions that the city is proposing to take to address those 2,911 lower income units. There are some sites that are already suitable for those units under the state's definition of that, and that means that they allow 30 dwelling units to the acre. For example, some of the sites in the downtown. There are quite a few sites that are proposed to have changes to their zoning or their general plan land use in order to address that 30 dwelling unit to the acre density. So we're going to touch on a couple of those sites on some subsequent slides. And quite a few of those sites also require allowing certain types of projects by right, so without discretionary approval. And those projects would need to have at least 20% of the units being affordable to those lower income categories. So another thing to note is that the city is working on these changes to the general plan and zoning currently, because if that change happens before the planning period for the housing element starts, which is October 15th, 2021, then that will basically put all of these sites in place for this 6th cycle. And if that doesn't happen by that date, then the by right or the requirement that I just described related to projects that have 20% affordable units would apply to those sites that require the changes. So a little bit more about how this zoning change or this general plan land use change would happen. The city is proposing to put in place some overlays, and they are called either the AHP or AHD overlay, and that is referencing the level of review that's required. In a lot of ways, they're similar to the overlay that is currently used to implement the AHOP program. And it is to facilitate affordable units being allowed on more sites in the city. So next slide. As I said, there are a couple slides on some of the sites that are proposed to address the lower income arena. There are quite a few, but we wanted to focus on a couple here during the presentation, and also to let you know that after the presentation, we're happy to look at any of the other sites and discuss any of the other sites that anyone has questions on. Again, these are shown in the supplement in the housing element. So this first slide shows a couple of sites that are located in the Business Research Park District. One is on Outlet Center Drive, another is on Ives Avenue. And the Outlet Center Drive parcel is a more than 10-acre parcel. Ives Avenue is about a 3-acre site. They are both vacant. And they both have potential projects that could happen on them, that the owners are interested in developing senior apartments and townhomes on the Outlet Center site, and some also future housing development on the Ives Avenue site. Both sites would receive an overlay in order to allow that 30 dwelling units to the acre that we described. And Program 35 in Chapter G describes the city's approach to creating that overlay for the Business Research Park District. Next slide, please. This site is another example. It is a non-vacant site. You can see there in the photo, there are some structures and vehicles on this site in this photo. It is currently designated limited manufacturing, and this was the former Gold Coast Transit site. It is about a 3-acre site, and it would also receive an overlay in order to allow that 30 dwelling units to the acre residential development potential. The current use is a vacant building and parking lot, so it is considered underutilized. It is located within that high quality transit corridor that Kathleen described, and also the transit priority area. It is also close to schools and amenities, so is considered a good site for multiple reasons. Next slide, please. And this last example is a site in the downtown. This actually shows some design and renderings of a potential project that is proposed on this site. It's on East 6th Street. And if this project was approved, it would create 87 units, and 86 of those would be affordable units. The density for that proposed project would be 207 dwelling units to the acre, so quite a bit higher than the 30 dwelling unit to the acre default density. And the next slide, please. So another significant piece of the way that the city is proposing to address the RDA is the accessory dwelling unit potential during the planning period. Up to 1,000 units are proposed to be addressed by accessory dwelling units or junior accessory dwelling units. And that's about 34% of that lower income RDA number. And this number, this projected number, is based on a couple of things. It's based on past trends of permitting accessory dwelling units in the city. And as Kathleen mentioned, that has increased significantly in recent years. The city has already put in place an accessory dwelling unit program and has a dedicated webpage to facilitate those types of units. And they have been updating their regulations and their zoning for accessory dwelling units as well in order to comply with state law and to facilitate these units in the city. This is a significant increase if this 1,000 units came about over the course of the planning period. So it is expected that it would happen, there would be a trend that would increase over time. And that's based on the fact that state law has become much more permissive regarding these units, and also the programs that the city is committing to. So not only are they already doing quite a bit of work to facilitate ADUs, but there are 3 programs in the housing element, 36, 37, and 38, that commit the city to some additional actions to promote this type of unit and make the process easier to develop them. Next slide, please. Now moving into the programs piece of the housing element. So the housing element is separated into analysis and background information, and then it, just like all of your other general plan elements, has implementation, and that includes goals, policies, and programs, and that is in Chapter G of the housing element. This slide actually addresses the programs that were in your 5th cycle housing element that are now proposed to be deleted. So these are covered in Chapter A of the housing element, and there are 3 of them, and 2 of them, Program 3 and Program 26, are related to the AHOP program that is proposed to be discontinued. So that's the reason that they are proposed to be removed. However, there are new programs, and the overlays that are proposed as part of those programs do retain or have similarities to the AHOP program and the overlay associated with it. The other program, Program 21, is related to the city's requirement to report to the state of California every year on their housing element progress. And that is something the city continues to do every year. It isn't required to be a program in the housing element, so that has been removed. Next slide, please. We wanted to cover the programs that are included in Chapter G in the update that are either brand new or substantially updated. So you'll see that in blue, in italics here, we've noted the programs that are 100% new. And I'll just give a brief description of each of these, and I'm very happy to take questions about this in the discussion. So Program 2 is the citywide homeowner repair program. This program was updated to reflect the current programming at the city for homeowners, and there are 4 different ways that homeowners can get loans for home repairs, and they basically focus on 4 different types of housing. Program 3, Kathleen mentioned earlier. So this is one of the programs that is new, and it does implement a lot of what we've been talking about to make the zoning and general plan changes that are needed to address the lower income RENA and to allow for 30 dwelling units to the acre on enough sites to address the RENA. And again, the plan is to complete this program ahead of the beginning of the 6th housing element planning period in October. Program 6 has a variety of pieces. It includes a list of zoning code amendments that are needed to comply with current state law. And this is an updated list. That there was a program like this in your current housing element, and the city did implement many of these changes that were in the current housing element. But state law does change frequently, and especially related to housing. So this program calls for updates related to accessory dwelling units, employee housing, density bonus law, supportive housing, low barrier navigation centers for the homeless, and the city will continue to make updates to comply with state law, as time goes on, as there are new laws that require that. Program 10 is about the city's inclusionary housing program, which Kathleen mentioned earlier. And so there has been a lot of work done in the last couple of years on this topic in the city. So the program has been updated to reflect the changes that the city has implemented and the studies that have been happening. And it also continues these requirements. Program 11 is the homeowner assistance program, and that has been updated to reflect the current parameters of the city's loan program. Program 16 relates to affordable housing projects that receive government subsidies, and there are quite a few of those in the city. And there was an update to state law in 2017, and that's what this program reflects. Program 19 is also in response to a pretty major new state law, Assembly Bill 686, which deals with affirmatively furthering fair housing. There are a couple new sections in the housing element that address this law, and this is the main program that addresses that law. And you will see that in the section for affirmatively furthering fair housing that other programs are also referenced. There are quite a few that support the fair housing work. Programs 30 and 31 are new programs, and they go along with program 3. So there is a specific part of relatively recent state law that requires that any sites that were included in either the previous housing element or the 2 previous housing elements have certain zoning allowed on them to allow affordable projects by right. And I mentioned that earlier. So these 2 programs implement that piece of the law. Next slide, please. So moving on, we have programs 32, 33, and 35 go together in a way because they are all funded by grants that the city has received. And so those are all underway, the work associated with those grants. Program 32 is a downtown infrastructure and financing study. Program 33 is analysis that's looking at the Oxnard corridor, high quality transit area and sites in that area, and also analyzing, what it takes to make that corridor be ready for housing and other uses, as Kathleen described earlier. Program 35 is also one that I described a little bit earlier, and this is looking at the business research park zone and opportunities for housing there. So all of those studies that go with those programs, will be completed after the housing element adoption. And so if there are any changes to the housing element needed as a result of that work, that would happen later. Program 34 is another program that's in response to a state law that was passed since the last housing element was adopted, and that is having the city put in place a procedure or policy to address projects that are subject to Senate Bill 35 streamlining. So there are certain affordable projects that get a type of streamlined review under state law. It's a very specific set of criteria and procedures. And so the state would like to see that every jurisdiction put in place a procedure for implementing that law. Programs 36, 37, and 38 I mentioned earlier, and these all relate to the accessory dwelling units that are identified in Chapter F, and how the city plans to, continue the programs that they're already doing related to ADUs, and then to build on those programs. So that includes possibly having pre-approved accessory dwelling unit plans, continuing to monitor the progress on permitting ADUs and adjusting efforts if that progress isn't keeping up with what's been projected. And then finally, to add efforts to promote ADUs and make sure that people know about that opportunity in the community. Finally, Program 39 deals with sites where there are residential units already. And this is for units that are affordable. They are required to be replaced if a project is proposed there with the same number of affordable units. And it also addresses any demolition of housing in the coastal zone. And that part of the law has been in place for a while, but the other piece regarding affordable units is a newer law. And I am going to hand it back over to Kathleen now. Thank you. Happy to take your questions after the presentation.
Thank you, Amy. We've been working extensively on the housing element update and the outreach, beginning really in 2020. We developed a stakeholder list of affordable housing advocates and realtors and interested parties, and we've been working with them on a monthly basis, also conducting surveys and digital comment tools, and really mobilized and flexed to provide for virtual input as a result of COVID. From September 21st, 2020 to October 30th, 2020, we developed a preliminary list of sites that were suitable for the default density, and we included and created an online mapping tool to be able to have members of the public give input regarding those sites. Many of them are are the sites for which you see in our supplement and which Amy covered. The mapping tool was available for the public from September 21st through October 30th. And during that time frame, we hosted a virtual community meeting. Through that process, we received 21 comments, and we added additional sites into the inventory. On October 22nd, we had another public workshop to kind of walk the public through how to comment on that map. And it was recorded, and it was translated into Spanish as well, and it was posted on the city's housing element update site for future viewing. Then beginning in January of 2021, in an effort to determine if the identified lower income housing sites were feasible, we sent out a survey letter to 45 of the property owners that held the 68 potential sites shown again within the supplement and that you have in your draft housing element. And those were 68 sites that were located outside of the downtown, because remember, the downtown already has that default density. The input was robust, and also the survey that we sent out was both in English and in Spanish, and it provided for multiple ways for property owners to respond, either through an email, through actually calling a person to talk about it. They also could give input on an online survey that they would just have to put the URL into, or through a QR code, and they could just access the survey that way. Responses were generally favorable. They provided input regarding the zone changes and the questions pertaining to housing in C2 and BRP zones. And some were supportive of were supportive of the zone change to accommodate lower income housing. Many of the property owners were supportive because there could be both housing as well as commercial. And then we actually conducted a public workshop on the draft housing element, which you're seeing and being presented this evening on March 24th. And we'll be able to give some input on the input. We'll be able to provide the commission with input on that meeting real time on April 1st. And then finally, the draft housing element has been available for public input from March 10th through April 16th. And the URL for how input is to be able to be provided is there on the screen. In the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of fly through this fairly quickly. We're currently at the April 1st Planning Commission date. We will then be bringing the draft housing element to the Housing and Economic Development Committee on April 13th, followed by going to council, the draft going to council April 29th. We'll then submit it to the state for their review and input, and then we'll bring back the revised housing element to the Planning Commission sometime late summer, and then we'll go to council in September for the mandatory approval before October 15th. And we are working on the environmental document through all this to implement the housing element, and commission action would be a recommendation on the environmental document and a recommendation on the housing element. When that occurs, though, will happen late summer. So this is more of an informational item this evening. It's a public meeting. It's not a required public workshop because we're not implementing any of the zoning changes or any of the general plan amendment land use changes at this time. The purpose of this meeting tonight is to receive public input on the draft housing element and to let the commission know what the next steps are. With that, staff's recommendation is we already conducted that presentation, and that that the Planning Commission recommend City Council that the Planning Commission recommend that the City Council submit the draft housing element to HCD for their review. At this point, this concludes staff's presentation, and we are available for questions. And as mentioned, I also have Heather Davis with Rincon Consultants, who is available for those questions as well. Thank you.